The press room buzzed with barely contained energy as Karoline Leavitt stepped up to the podium, her expression composed but alert. The air was thick with anticipation. Reporters from mainstream liberal outlets, notebooks and recorders in hand, leaned forward with a sense of purpose that went beyond routine questioning. There was a clear strategy in the air, an unspoken agreement among them. Today was the day they would corner her, trip her up, and force a misstep they could amplify for headlines. The lights were bright, the cameras locked in, and the tension practically hummed from wall to wall. The moment her name was announced, a ripple moved through the room like a wave hitting a shoreline. Karoline stood tall, dressed in a crisp blazer that matched her poised demeanor. She didn't blink as the first question was flung toward her, sharp and loaded. "Ms. Leavitt, do you truly believe the media isn't doing its job when it questions government overreach, or is this just another attempt to silence the press?" The tone wasn't inquisitive, it was accusatory. She didn't answer right away. She allowed a measured pause, scanning the room, reading the energy, knowing exactly what game they were playing. Another reporter quickly piled on. "Are you suggesting we shouldn't hold people in power accountable? Because that's what journalism is." There were murmurs of agreement, nods from corners of the room. Cameras zoomed in closer. The ambush had begun. A third voice joined the pile-up, more aggressive this time, pressing her on past statements she'd made about media bias. "You've accused the press of distorting facts. Do you have proof, or is that just political theater?" The smirks on some faces made it obvious they were expecting her to stumble, to fumble through a defense. It was all choreographed, a verbal firing squad designed to rattle her composure. Some of the reporters exchanged knowing glances, confident that their rapid-fire questioning would overwhelm her. Phones were already being held up to record, anticipating a viral clip, something they could spin, twist, and push across platforms. But Karoline didn't flinch. Her hands rested lightly on the podium as she listened. Every accusatory word, every snide undertone, was noted but not acknowledged. The room might have thought they had the upper hand, but there was something in her stillness, calculated, steady, that suggested otherwise. The moment was loaded, the silence between questions just as deafening as the barrage itself. Everyone in that press room thought they were about to see a takedown. What they didn't realize was that they had just walked straight into a storm of their own making, and Karoline Leavitt was the eye of it. Karoline's silence wasn't hesitation, it was strategy. As the room bristled with smug anticipation, she finally leaned slightly toward the microphone, her voice calm but edged with unmistakable firmness. "Thank you for the questions," she began, her tone almost disarmingly polite. "It's always interesting to be lectured on journalism by those who've long abandoned objectivity." A sharp intake of breath swept through the press corps, and a few reporters visibly shifted in their seats. The sudden shift in control was almost imperceptible, but it was there. Karoline had seized the tempo without raising her voice, without breaking a sweat. She continued, hands relaxed on the podium, each word deliberate. "Let's talk about accountability," she said. "Where was the accountability when major networks pushed narratives that were proven false months later? Where was the tough questioning when policies that affected millions were being rubber-stamped without a fraction of the scrutiny I'm receiving here today?" She wasn't raising her voice, but the force of her words struck with the impact of a gavel hitting the bench. The very reporters who had been so eager to trap her were now locked into her rhythm, their earlier smirks slowly fading. One journalist attempted to interrupt, perhaps to regain momentum, but Karoline barely acknowledged him. Her gaze swept the room with quiet authority. "You ask if I have proof," she said, turning her head slightly toward the one who posed the challenge. "You are the proof. You sit here pretending to be objective observers, yet your bias isn't hidden, it's broadcast, daily, in every leading question, every selective omission, every story that conveniently fits a narrative. And when someone calls it out, your defense is to play the victim." Her delivery was surgical, precise, clean, and absolutely unflinching. There was a strange hush now. Even those who moments ago were shouting over each other were suddenly silent. Karoline allowed that silence to stretch just long enough before stepping forward again, her expression unchanging. "I don't fear the press," she said, "but I do expect better from those who claim to represent truth." That line hung in the air like a suspended verdict. Cameras were still rolling, but the smug certainty behind them had crumbled. It wasn't just a response, it was a dismantling. And the reporters knew it. They had expected deflection or evasion, but what they received was a rhetorical sledgehammer wrapped in professionalism. Some of the reporters glanced at each other, unsure how to proceed. The trap had failed, and worse, they had been exposed in the attempt. Karoline gave no indication of satisfaction, no visible gloating. She simply stood her ground with the composed conviction of someone who had not only anticipated this exact moment but had prepared for it. Her calm clapback wasn't emotional, it was intentional, built on facts, and armed with confidence. In less than 2 minutes, the press room had gone from a coordinated offensive to a stunned audience, forced to reckon with the reality that they were no longer steering the narrative. The stillness that followed Karoline's response was almost cinematic. No follow-up questions, no murmurs, just a charged silence that buzzed with disbelief. She let that moment breathe, refusing to rush. Then, without changing her tone, she leaned just a little closer to the microphone, her eyes locked with a reporter seated front row. What she said next would echo across the internet in a matter of seconds. "Maybe if you spent more time reporting the truth and less time pushing agendas," she said smoothly, "Americans might actually trust you again." The line was sharp, undeniable, and it sliced straight through the manufactured outrage that had filled the room minutes earlier. A collective gasp followed, not loud, but unmistakable. A few reporters looked down at their notes, others looked directly at the cameras as if unsure whether to keep filming or shut them off. Karoline didn't move. She knew what that sentence had done. It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a viral moment, the kind of phrase that headlines are built around, the kind that pundits quote and clip and play on loop. It was more than words, it was a political mic drop, precise and devastating. Reporters who had once been visibly confident now looked rattled. One of them, flustered, attempted to reframe a question, trying to steer attention away from Karoline's viral blow. "So you're saying the media should just accept government messaging without criticism?" he asked, voice wavering. Karoline didn't miss a beat. "No," she replied, "I'm saying criticism without consistency is propaganda in disguise." Her delivery was crisp, her posture unwavering. It was as if she was lecturing a room of students rather than facing down an army of detractors. Outside the press room, newsrooms and social media accounts lit up. The line had already begun circulating. Editors were clipping the moment, influencers were tweeting it, and support from viewers began to flood comment sections. Her critics tried to spin it as hostility toward journalism, but the clip spoke for itself. Karoline hadn't attacked the media, she had held up a mirror. And in that reflection, many saw exactly what they didn't want the public to see. Inside the room, the mood had shifted entirely. The reporters no longer looked like a unified front. The plan to corner her had collapsed under the weight of her conviction. Karoline remained at the podium, steady and still, knowing exactly what she had just accomplished. The most important part wasn't what she said, it was that she had said it clearly, calmly, and without fear. The sentence had landed like a strike of lightning, and as the echoes of it settled into the silence, everyone in that room knew, something had changed, and it could not be undone. The tension was now palpable, no longer electrifying but uneasy, like a storm that had rolled in quicker than anyone expected. One reporter, visibly irritated and red-faced, slammed his pen onto his notepad and launched into a frustrated outburst. "You talk about bias, but look at your own affiliations, your talking points, how is that not spin?" His voice cracked under the strain, betraying the panic beneath the challenge. It was meant to reframe the dynamic, to flip the pressure back onto Karoline, but it only highlighted his loss of composure. Cameras captured his flushed face and trembling hands. The crowd of journalists, once a solid wall of confidence, watched uncomfortably, unsure whether to join in or stay silent. Karoline, in contrast, didn't flinch. She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "If you're referring to transparency, I'm glad to disclose my affiliations," she replied coolly. "But unlike many of you, I don't pretend to be neutral while carrying water for one side." That response hit harder than any personal insult. It wasn't just an accusation, it was a challenge to the legitimacy of the very room she stood in. The reporter tried to cut her off, raising his voice again, but this time it cracked fully, revealing the unraveling frustration. "You're just deflecting," he barked. "That's all this is." Karoline didn't even raise her volume in response. "Am I deflecting?" she asked slowly, "or are you uncomfortable being held to the same standard you demand from everyone else?" The question hung heavy in the air, rhetorical yet stinging. There was no script for this moment, no pre-written talking points that could undo what had just unfolded. Some journalists looked down, typing quietly. Others simply stared. The meltdown wasn't just a single reporter losing his cool, it symbolized the collapse of the narrative structure they had so confidently built before she entered the room. In a final attempt to save face, the reporter reached for a common line of defense. "So you're saying journalism itself is broken?" he asked, grasping for a soundbite. Karoline didn't smile, but the glint in her eyes was unmistakable. "No," she answered, "I'm saying when journalism becomes activism in disguise, it stops serving the people and starts serving power." There it was, the final blow. The room didn't react immediately. It was as if everyone needed a second to process that line, to absorb the implication of what had just occurred. The meltdown was no longer limited to one person, it had become a shared, silent realization that the ground had shifted beneath their feet. Outside, the clip had already gone viral. Inside, the collapse of control was undeniable. Karoline let the silence linger for just a moment longer, then gently stepped back from the microphone. Her words had done what she intended. They cut through the noise, dismantled the ambush, and left behind only truth and tension. She gathered her notes with calm precision, not in haste, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knew they had just won a battle without ever raising their voice. The reporters watched her closely, still recovering from the rhetorical strikes she delivered. Some avoided her gaze entirely, others still held their pens, unsure whether to scribble notes or simply sit with the weight of what they'd just witnessed. As she turned to leave the podium, the room remained strangely hushed. A few attempted weak follow-ups, but none dared raise their voice again. The commanding presence she'd maintained was unbroken. With each step toward the door, it became clearer, she had not only controlled the narrative, she had rewritten it. Just before exiting, she paused, turned slightly back to the press corps, and delivered one final line. Accountability doesn't begin and end with politicians. It includes the press, and the American people are watching. With that, she turned and walked out, heels echoing against the floor like punctuation marks. Outside the press room, a spontaneous crowd had gathered, supporters, curious onlookers, media teams who hadn't made it inside. As the door opened and Karoline stepped through, a wave of applause greeted her. It wasn't the staged kind. It wasn't orchestrated. It was raw, impulsive, a reaction to the courage and composure they had seen on live feeds just minutes earlier. Phones went up instantly. People began cheering her name, shouting words of encouragement, their voices full of relief that someone had finally said what so many were thinking. Karoline didn't wave or bask in the moment. She simply nodded, offered a brief smile, and continued walking forward. Behind her, the press room was still reeling. Inside, the reporters scrambled to regain narrative control, but outside, the story had already taken flight. Clips of her responses were exploding across every platform, headlines were being drafted at warp speed, and the public reaction was pouring in with a force none of the networks had anticipated. It wasn't just a win for Karoline Leavitt, it was a moment. The kind of moment that shifts public perception, that becomes a reference point in future debates, that resonates far beyond a single news cycle. She had walked into an ambush and walked out with the upper hand. The walk-off wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. It marked the end of old assumptions about who held power in that room. And as she disappeared into the hallway, one truth rang louder than any question asked that day: the narrative no longer belonged to the press, it belonged to the people.